Hello, everybody. And today we're going to be taking a look at the maritime empires between 1450 and 1750 and focusing on the political and economic developments that result from the development and growth of these maritime empires. So, the first thing we're going to look at is the economic developments. As countries like Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands expand their influence throughout the globe, we see an economic transformation. And that economic transformation is called the commercial revolution. So the commercial revolution basically means the increased trade that's taking place during this period between 1450 and 1750. And the commercial revolution is going to be largely focused on Europe's increased involvement in trade, but also the increased trade activity throughout the globe. So we already knew that trade existed before all of this happened. It's not like trade just suddenly begins here, but the activity level, the amount of goods flowing back and forth, and the interconnection is going to grow much more than we've seen before. And that growth is the commercial revolution. So, in terms of causes, a lot of these causes relate back to Western Europe, the involvement of West Europe into the global economy. West Europe establishing trade routes between the Americas and Europe and Africa, for example. The development of the Manila Galleon, which connected one major cause of the commercial revolution, which is increasing number of trade routes. And then the second thing we can put in as a cause is the increased involvement of the European nations. Another cause that we can put in here is that with population growth in Europe, there's a higher demand for luxury goods within Europe. And that demand is going to drive that expedition and establishment of more trade. So, just to go over those three causes can be summed up as one, more trade activity throughout the trade routes that are being established. The second one is more European involvement throughout the global trade network. Then the third one is more demand for both Asian goods, such as silk and porcelain from China, spices from the Southeast Asia, but then later, the demand for sugar from the plantations within the Americas. So all of those things kind of come together to drive forward this new developing commercial revolution. Now, the consequences are nicely summed up by the visual on your right. So as you see, increased trade does three things. One, increases the need for workers. So this is told from really a European point of view. The idea that serfs are going to start moving to towns to do more work. But we could also say that with the commercial revolution, more workers are needed, and that leads to an increase in the transatlantic slave trade. So you can connect that to more than just the European perspective. You can connect that to a global perspective. So when we look at more workers needed, that's a consequence of the commercial revolution. More workers is answered by the development of the transatlantic slave trade. So when we look at more cashing, banking, and lending services available, these fall into the category of financial innovations. And so Europe is just going to have more money involved. So more money is going to be available for building businesses. A lot of that money is coming from global silver, the influx of silver, but also from the increased profits that are coming from the trade. So again, we can connect this to the global structure. And then the last thing is that merchants' wealth and power expands within Europe. Now, this we're going to just kind of keep within Europe. But we can talk about this within Africa, for example. This merchant class that is emerging is becoming a wealthier segment of society, and they have more demands for different ways for the economy to work. So, if you remember, Europe was always agricultural. Now we have this merchant based economy growing and developing in strength. They're also growing in wealth, which is going to fund the central kings and fund the development of the centralized monarchs. So we can see a political ramification to this development. And then the other thing is that these merchants within Europe are going to want to show off their power and status. So they're going to be sponsoring artistic innovations. They're going to patronize the art. And we're going to see a flourishing of arts and culture within Europe that is connected to the commercial revolution. So here's the main point: the commercial revolution has many different consequences. It changes the way labor is done, it changes the way financing is done, and it develops a whole new class of people. And that class becomes extremely influential within society. Now, the second one, letter B, the price revolution, this is a little bit simpler. The price revolution refers to the increase in prices throughout Europe. So basically, prices go up for just about everything. And this price revolution is going to benefit the merchants because the merchants can sell their products off for higher and higher prices. It's going to hurt the landed nobility because the landed nobility they have fixed rates. They collect their money in the form of rents and in the form of taxes and fees. And those things are pretty consistent over time. So what's happening is that the nobles, the landed nobility is starting to lose a little steam. But that's getting a little bit more complicated than you need. Basically, the price revolution is the increase in prices for consumer goods and for food for a variety of things. The causes of this increase in price really comes down to inflation. As we flood the European market with gold and silver, particularly silver from the New World, and you have an increased population that has increased demands, all of those factors are going to work together to drive prices up. Now, letter C is one you're going to want to star and know: mercantilism. So, mercantilism is an economic philosophy, it's an economic theory. And I'm going to kind of get into the weeds a little bit here because I think it's that important. The first rule of mercantilism is that wealth is fixed. In other words, you can't create more wealth. So, the first rule of mercantilism, and this stays with your definition, the first rule is that wealth is fixed. The second rule is that wealth equals power. So, if you want to be a powerful nation, you must be a wealthy nation. So, the first rule, wealth is fixed. The second rule, wealth is power. The third rule is that if one country gets wealthier, another country has to get poorer. So, if I lose money, I lose power. And that means somebody else is getting more powerful than me. So, that's the third rule. If one country gets richer, another country gets poor. So that brings me to the fourth rule of mercantilism. The fourth rule of mercantilism says you want to maximize your exports and you want to minimize your imports. So, in other words, you want to sell stuff to other countries to get their money, but you don't want to buy stuff from other countries because that means your money leaves you. So if wealth is fixed and power is measured in wealth, and if one country gets poor, that means another country gets richer, then you want to control the trade flow between you and other countries. And you want the trade to be in your favor. So you want the balance of trade to be in your favor. You want some other country buying more of your stuff than you are buying of their stuff. So that creates the need for colonies. And that's the fifth rule of mercantilism. The fifth rule of mercantilism is that colonies are necessary for the mother country to succeed because colonies can supply the raw materials without you having to buy them from somebody else. And the colonies can supply markets for your products. So you want colonies to exclusively trade with you and your nation only. So when we look at mercantilism, mercantilism is an economic theory that wants to guarantee the balance of trade to be in the favor of one country as opposed to another. So, what that means is that mercantilism is going to put restrictions and regulations on trade to make sure things favor the country. They are not for free trade. And the second thing is important because when you start putting these limitations and rules and regulations, nations compete with each other. They compete for access to markets, they compete for colonies, they compete for access to resources. Because if one country controls the spices and they're the ones who sell the spices, then other countries are going to lose money and thus lose power. So mercantilism is going to drive international competition between nations as they fight over market access and resource access. And that's going to drive a lot of 18th century conflicts, particularly in Europe. Lastly, we get to the joint stock companies. And I've mentioned this before, so I'll kind of keep it brief. A joint stock company is a financial innovation. And what happens is a company sells off shares or stocks of their company to investors. And that way, the company generates an investment, money that they can use to undertake their expedition. And the thing about the joint stock companies is that it divides up the risk. So if I'm sending a ship on an expedition and I finance that ship by myself, if that ship sinks, I'm the one who loses a lot of money. But if 10 people finance that ship and the ship sinks, then only a tenth of that loss is visited upon me as an investor. So what that's doing is it's spreading risk amongst investors. And investors like to minimize risk as much as possible. So this system, and this is the big thing, this system of joint stocks or joint stock companies is going to lead to a development and increase of trade. In other words, the investors see a safer bet, a safer investment. They're more likely to invest, which means we have more investment happening, which means we have more expeditions and more trade ships going throughout the Atlantic Ocean and into the Indian Ocean, and more European ships are starting to dominate the global trade network. And the two countries that really benefit are the Dutch, they're the big beneficiaries, and the English. So the joint stock company is critical to this commercial revolution and this increase in trade. So as we look back over here, the commercial revolution is just describing what's going on. The price revolution is a consequence of the commercial revolution. Mercantilism is the government's philosophy during the commercial revolution. And the joint stock company is a financial innovation that allows for this growth of the commercial revolution. So these four are going to tie together. Now let's shift away from the economics and talk about the politics. And for this may look like more, but actually it's going to go quick. So the first thing is that as the Spaniards and the Portuguese show up, there's a collapse of the Native American empires. And we're particularly focused with the Aztecs and the Inca. So one of the big reasons that empires like the Inca and the Aztecs fall is because of diseases. Diseases are going to kill major leaders, which is going to spark political instability. It's going to devastate populations, and that's going to have a ripple effect. So, for example, if a Western epidemic spreads throughout an Aztec town and a number of farmers die, then that means the survivors do not have a food supply. So it has ramifications more than just people dying, but it undermines the political and economic stability of the empires. And that goes for both the Aztecs and the Inca. The second thing is that the Spaniards enjoyed a technological advantage with gunpowdered weapons and horses. But the diseases are probably more critical to explaining why these empires fall. You know, a small group of like 100 Spaniards up against Tenochtitlan of the Aztec Empire and the Aztec warriors, gunpowder weapons or no, those 100 soldiers don't stand much of a chance. It's the diseases that really weakened those empires that allowed the Spaniards to exploit vulnerabilities within the empires. Now, we kind of split this up into two conquests: the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, led by a conquistador called Cortez. And the biggest advantage that Cortez enjoyed was alliances with neighboring tribes. So if you remember, The Aztecs created a tributary system that forced neighboring tribes to shove money the Aztecs' way. And that created a great and human beings for human sacrifice. That created a great deal of resentment towards the Aztecs. And there were plenty of Native American tribes who are more than happy to support the Spaniards in their attack on the Aztecs. And the second one is that as the Spanish conquered the Aztecs, they didn't just take over the empire, they destroyed a great deal of the culture of the Aztecs. Written records are going to be destroyed, temples are going to be destroyed, idols are going to be destroyed. Basically, the Aztec culture is going to go up in flames for the most part. And this has an impact on the way we understand history because most of what we know about the Aztecs come from Spanish sources at the time, conquistadors who described Tenochtitlan. The way we know what Tenochtitlan looks like is not only based on excavation of the city, but also based on Spaniard descriptions. And one of the things that we've been talking about in this class is the idea of sourcing documents. The Spaniards looked down on the Aztecs as savages, as brutes. So their description of Aztec society is coming from the Spanish perspective, and it's going to be colored and influenced by that bias. And that's something we want to keep in mind as we study history. Um, the last one is the Spanish conquest of the Inca, and this is carried out by a conquistador named Pizarro. And there's a lot of similarities between what happens to the Inca Empire and what happened to the Aztec Empire. Diseases are going to weaken the empire. The destruction of Inca culture in this case is very similar to the destruction of Aztec culture, to the point that all we know about Inca history that largely comes from the Spaniards. So you can look at the Inca, and I'm mentioning it less than the Aztecs. The two of them have a great deal of similarity. Now, what comes into place is the Spanish colonial system. The colonial system is going to be governed by viceroys. So think of viceroys. You take the Spanish American empire. So, in other words, the empire of Spain within the Americas, and you divide it up into 5 regions. And each region has a viceroy. And if you look at the word viceroy, you can see the word royalty is within it. And a vice royalty, think of it that way, somebody who's kind of acting in the place of the royalty. So if it helps, think of them as governors. So viceroys are both regions and the particular leaders of that region. And the viceroys are supposed to implement royal law. So they're supposed to follow the Spanish law. However, and this is number two, Spain is far away. It takes a long time to get back and forth between Spain and the Latin America. So what happens is that these regions begin to self-govern. And it's not so much that they declare independence. We're not there yet. But they sort of settle their problems without constantly negotiating with the Spanish king. And the Spanish king, for the most part, is going to leave these regions alone to do their own thing. So, what we're starting to create is a unique political identity within the Americas. And this is setting us up for our next unit, which starts dealing with revolutions. But for now, all I want you to know is that the viceroys are the way the Spanish Americas were governed by Spain. And the viceroys had a great deal of autonomy and freedom to do what they thought was best. And that starts to develop a sense of independence within that region. Now, the other thing that's reinforced by the colonial system is the Incomita system, which deals with the way labor is used. So as the Spanish come over into the Americas and they begin to divide land up and they begin to claim land, so on and so forth, they're going to force the Native Americans to work for the Spanish landowner. And before you call it enslavement, you want to compare this more to serfdom than slavery, because Native Americans weren't necessarily being bought and sold the way that enslaved Africans would be bought and sold later. So we don't really have the chattel slave labor system here. This isn't chattel slavery. This is more like feudalism, where serfs work for the landlords, and the landlords could legally demand the labor from the serfs. And in this case, it's the Native Americans providing the labor to the Spanish. And that system of coerced labor we refer to as the Incomita system. Now, the other system that develops, the Asandia system, I'm going to go with that pronunciation today, is a land based system. So, what happens is that as the conquistadors conquer regions, the Spanish government grants them land, and that land is referred to as Asandia. And the idea is that this land is very much like the nobles' lands in Europe, and that land belongs to the nobles or to the landowner. That landowner gets to grow. They have a great deal of control over that property, and this is where your plantations are going to start taking root. Um, no pun intended. So you have a whole way of splitting land up, which is not heard of by the Native American societies. And this is going to increase the power of the Spaniards. So for number three and number four, we see a change to labor, which puts the Native Americans into a position of coerced labor. And we also see a land earning system that develops that the Americas had never seen before. And both of these are reinforced by the Spanish colonial government. Our last one are European rivalries. So the big five, Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, and the Netherlands, they're competing because of the economic theory of mercantilism. They want access to markets and they want access to resources. And this is going to create tensions between all five states. So in the New World, in the Americas, Spain and Portugal are our rivals. And the way to stop Spain and Portugal from fighting is the famous Treaty of Tordesillas. And the Treaty of Tordesillas is an agreement between Portugal and Spain to kind of draw a line on the map. And everything west of that line is going to be Spanish territory. And everything east of that line is going to be Portuguese territory. Now, the line runs right through what is present day Brazil. And at the time of the treaty, they didn't know Brazil was there. So the line runs through Brazil. When the Portuguese find the land on the east side of the line, they claim Portugal. So you have this attempt to kind of keep Spain and Portugal from fighting. They have this treaty that kind of divides the world between them. Of course, the English, the French, and the Dutch could care less about that treaty. But what this does is it keeps Spain and Portugal from coming to blows. France and Britain are going to be late to the game. By the time France and Britain get into the picture, Spain has largely, I apologize, Spain has largely conquered and taken over a great deal of South America, Central America, a lot of the West Indies, Southern United States, and Southwest United States. The French and the British are going to have their tension over North America, with the French kind of setting up in the Mississippi Valley and in Canada, and the English setting up along the eastern seaboard for what we call the 13 original colonies. And there's going to be competition between the two nations within North America. And France, Britain, Dutch, and Spain are all going to compete within the West Indies. And trade within the West Indies is going to be highly competitive. And these four nations are going to have rivalries, trading rivalries. Sometimes they spill over to wars between the nations. In India, meanwhile, there are these companies called East India companies. The British have an East India Company, the French have an East India Company, the Dutch have an East India Company. And these East India companies, to make a long story short, were given the monopoly or the sole authority to conduct business in India for their respective nation or their respective nation. So this creates a competition between the British, the French, and the Portuguese. You remember the Portuguese arrived in the Indian region first. The British and the French start establishing themselves within that market. And Britain and France are going to really become the rivals within India. And then lastly, within the East Indies, which we would call the Spice Islands, which you could refer to as Indonesia, you can call the East Indies is usually what we refer to it as. So now we've kind of shifted over to Southeast Asia, where a lot of the spices are produced. And the Portuguese have already established themselves in that region. And the Dutch are coming in to push the Portuguese out, and the Dutch are looking to establish their presence. One of the examples of this tension shows up in Japan, for example, when the East India Company of the Dutch are going to work with the shogun to get rid of the Portuguese and the Spanish missionaries. So you can see this competition in a variety of forms. The big thing is to see that European countries compete with each other. And one of these competitions breaks over into the 7 Years' War, which is one of our first global conflicts between 1756 and 1763. And it pits England and France against one another. And if you look at the map to the right, you can see the orange for the British on the top map of North America and how the English are able to expand their holdings at French expense. In India, England and France are going to have fighting between the two of them. And ultimately, England is going to win out on that. And then Europe, we kind of have an English alliance versus a French alliance. So the 7 Years' War is usually seen as an English versus French war. And in the end, it's the English who are really going to win out. And by the time we hit 1750s, 1770s, I mean, England has started to establish a huge maritime empire, and France is going to start receding from that because of their losses in the 7 Years' War. And what we're left with is this strong European presence throughout the world in the Americas, along parts of the coast of Africa, along the coast of India, and having control within the East Indies, where the Spice Islands are. And what I want you to see is that that competition that drove the Europeans to establish these empires are also going to drive the Europeans to war with each other. And with that, we'll kind of just end it there. This should take care of the political and economic developments at the time. And as always, make sure you come to class with questions. And I will see you next time. Take care.